excited about this panel as well. There are a number of people on this panel that I know quite well over the years that are doing incredible work, and I'm very excited that they're here to speak to it. So just so you all, we just heard from Shika and a great deal about sort of the crises that we're all facing and the reality of that as a whole, and essentially that if the government will come after migrants, they'll come after you next. And they are, and they're coming. And she spoke to Nancy and some other folks that are facing state repression right now for just speaking out. So I think that really leads us into just the crisis migration panel, which is crisis migration and how national emergencies shape immigration policy. We all see it. I don't feel like I have to give much of an intro beyond that. We all live in the United States right now and are experiencing what it means. So what I'd like to do is I would like to give it off to Lupita Romero from Working Class Heroes Podcast Radio on WBAI. And go ahead and give it a whirl. Thank you so much for joining us, all of you all. Nathan as well, Alex, and of course, Boss Kadiri. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamila, and welcome everybody to this panel. I'm very happy to be here. As Jamila said, I'm an undocumented immigrant activist, and I'm also co-host for Working Class Heroes. This is going to be an amazing conversation. I'm really happy to introduce all of our panelists, which include Nathan Tankis, Alex Narista, and Adu Kadiri. And so just to give you a little bit of background, and they'll have a chance to talk about their work and themselves a little bit when we kick off the discussion. But to give you a little bit more of their background, Nathan is the Director of Research at the Modern Money Network and a research fellow at the Global Institute of Sustainable Prosperity. Alex is the Director of Immigration Studies at the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. His popular publications have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and the Washington Post, and most other major publications in the United States. His peer-reviewed academic publications have appeared in the World Bank Economic Review, the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization, Economic Affairs, and the Fletcher Security Review, among other things. Alex regularly appears on Fox News, MSNBC, Bloomberg, NPR, and other television and radio stations. So you're really in for a treat for that. Adu is a community organizer, public health, and human rights advocate with over 15 years of experience. He currently works full-time as a community organizer with the African Communities Together in New York City. Before moving to the US in 2014, Adu previously worked as the head of programs for the International Center for Advocacy and Rights to Health and program officer for Heartland Alliance International in Abuja, Nigeria, where he coordinated HIV prevention projects, documented human rights violations against some of the most at-risk populations, and was a part of a team that coordinated Nigeria's first clinic serving these populations. So I'll leave it to them to explain a little bit more of what that translates into as they work today on migrant rights issues. And let's just get going with this wonderful conversation. We have a first set of questions just to get people familiar with everything that you guys do. And as I ask you the question, you can first talk a little bit about your work, and then we can get into your answer. So for Alex, I know that you do a lot of work around economic emergencies in developing countries and can speak to policies that deal with that. Can you tell us a little bit about your work? And then to talk a little bit more about how national emergencies end up being the driving forces for people to migrate into other countries?
Well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here today on a panel with such interesting other folks to talk about this issue. The major crisis in the world today that has been the crisis for as long as humans have existed is poverty. People around the world, until in 1800, for instance, about 95% of people around the world lived on less than $2 a day, which is basically the definition of extreme poverty. Now, since then, there's been a lot of improvement for billions of people in terms of their standard of living. But there is still about a billion or so people who are very desperately poor, who are living on $2 a day or less around the world. And the reason why they're poor is not because they're stupid. It's not because they're lazy. It's not because they're, weak or anything like that. It's because they live in countries where they are just very unproductive for a lot of reasons. You have wars, you have famines, there's no business or capital investment. There's no reason for these folks to invest in their own skills, because if they do, drug gang or rebels or the government will take it all away from them. But in a few places around the world, there is prosperity. And if these folks are able to move from their poor countries to the United States, like a lot of our ancestors did, like a lot of you all did who are on this panel, then you're able to become much more productive, have much more fulfilling lives, and are able to provide for yourselves and your family with much better, with much lower outputs, with much less work, and much more successfully. And that is the crisis that I think free immigration across borders can massively alleviate, is by bringing people from these desperately poor situations to places like the United States, where they can and do lift themselves up by being out of those bad places. So this crisis of humanity that has existed since the beginning of humanity, if we had a free immigration policy today, it would shrink dramatically and improve the lives of hundreds of millions of people around the world, unlike anything else that we could possibly do.
What would a free migration policy look like, in your opinion?
So I think it's very simple, right? I think it's basically one page of law. Like currently, Title 8 of the US Code regulates immigration. It's thousands and thousands of pages long, highly restrictive. Most people who want to come here, probably more than 90%, there's no way for them to even apply. Like yourself in your situation. Like, people don't know this. It's very difficult to impossible to come here. I think a free immigration policy would basically say, if you're not a convicted or suspected violent or property criminal, not a suspected or actual national security threat, and don't have a very serious and highly contagious disease, you should be able to come to the United States to live and work and eventually become a citizen. And that's about it. That's basically half a page. So, I mean, that's what I think of when I think of free immigration.
I want to see what the other panelists have to say about this topic and what you just brought up. Could you, before that, just tell us a little bit about what your work looks like today and what you're doing?
Yeah, so my background is I'm trained in economics, master's degree from the London School of Economics. And a lot of my work is about exposing the massive benefits of immigration, primarily for Americans, because I'm trying to convince Americans to change policies and become more welcoming. A lot of this is writing really dense, peer-reviewed academic work and policy papers, but I also write a lot of blogs. I'm very active on Twitter, and I go on the news a lot. So I've been on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox News about 8 times. To debate him. And they won't have me on anymore because I beat him every time. So if you want to YouTube my name, you can see some pretty good appearances with me. So that's what I basically try to do.
Sorry.
I try to convince people.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you because people are telling you to slow down in the window.
Sorry.
I don't know if you see them. It's okay. It's just for interpretation. But go
No
ahead.
problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah. So my job is to try to convince people, policymakers, average people in the media, that immigration is good for the United States and we should liberalize it.
Got it. Before we move on to the next question, it might actually be good to hear what other folks here are doing in their work. So Nathan, I'd like to ask you what you do for work and what you want to bring to this conversation today.
Hi, I'm the research director of a Modern Monday Network, as you said. and in that capacity, work a lot on policies around economic policy, especially responding to economic crises, and especially policies that are aimed at full employment, at increasing wages, at building a stronger social safety net. And in the other capacity, I write a newsletter called Notes on the Crises, which has gotten a lot of attention, where I've been covering the coronavirus depression from about March, when it was a little early to fully to be thinking about the economic consequences fully. So that's mainly what I do, and so in that capacity, the work I do intersects with immigration policy to the extent that immigration policy is wrapped up in questions of employment policy and full employment, and to the extent to which the United States discriminatory policies towards immigrants complicate their crises response, especially the response to the coronavirus depression.
Yeah, no, there's so much that we can go into, and we will try at the very least when it comes to that, those two issues. Before we get to that, Audrey, would you like to introduce yourself and the work that you're doing right now?
Yeah, sure. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Yeah, again, my name is Al, originally from Nigeria. Yeah, I work currently as a full-time community organizer with African Communities Together. And in my role as an organizer, African Communities Together is it's a membership-based organization. So I help in building the membership base, building the membership base, developing leaders to be able to advocate for issues around immigrants. And we also do a lot of community awareness, know your rights, education, and also leadership development. So this is what I do at African Communities Together as one of the organizers. And having said that, the second question, that what are we bringing to this conference? For me, based on what causes migration, like Alex said, there are different reasons why people migrate. One of them is climate change, war, police brutality, for example, and people travel for humanitarian purposes. And we know that settling down in another country or starting a new life in another country is very, very hard, very challenging, especially if you don't have access to the right resources or information to start a new life. I know this firsthand because I'm an asylee in the United States, and when I came here, I know how it was challenging to even get access to resources, and that's on top of the fact that I speak English. And imagine people who don't even speak English coming to this country to even access, or to start a new life. Imagine how challenging it will be for them to access these services. So I would say that I just want to share a little bit about what we do, as people on ground and organization, what organization can do, and what we are doing to ensure that these immigrants who are fleeing their country for whatever reasons are able to integrate into a newfound country. And one of those things we can do, and that we have done in New York City, for example, is to advocate for policy changes, policies that affect or that make life harder for immigrants. For example, advocating for policy change to, like I said, in New York City recently, we advocated for the inclusion of French and Arabic in the top LEP languages in New York City. And that's because most of our members are from West Africa. And in West Africa, we have more French speakers than English speakers. And when these immigrants come here, it's hard for them to access services, right? So because they don't speak English doesn't mean they don't they don't know what they want. It's a challenge because of language barrier. So we advocated for that, and by 2017, French and Arabic were added to the top LEP languages in New York City, and that has made life easy for French-speaking African immigrants who come here to seek, to start a new life. Another thing we have done is the Green Light campaign. The Green Light campaign that we did last year, that was the Green Light bill that was passed last year, was to allow undocumented immigrants to have driver's license in New York State, right? Because it's very challenging in New York State if you don't, in New York State before now, if you don't have a driver's license. And we have a lot of immigrants who live in upstate who don't have access to the kind of luxury of transportation we have in New York City, who have family, and they will need to drive and take their children to places. So this was a very big relief for undocumented immigrants. These are policy change. Now talk about service provision. When we talk about service provision, we connect people to free immigration services. When you come to America, for example, there are laws for you to resettle, right? So we connect you to a lawyer who will talk to you and determine what kind of immigration relief or humanitarian relief you might be eligible for. And even if you are not eligible for anything, they will also advise you on steps and what to do, which has really, really helped our people. Also, we connect people to free healthcare. Health is wealth. If you are not healthy, you can't even do anything. So we connect people also to free health services and English service learning, ESL learning, job readiness, job training, and language access. Since we won the language access campaign in 2017, we've been having a lot of requests to help in language access. For Africans. So these are some of the things we've done. And quickly for the COVID-19, for example, this to help immigrants in New York City to cushion the effect of COVID-19. Recently, we got funding to give people cash assistance, because if you have papers, you'll be eligible for the stimulus check or unemployment benefits. But if you don't have papers, then we have a lot of people in New York City alone. We have over 800,000 people who are undocumented, and these people also lost their income and work. So they didn't have anything. So we got this cash assistance to help some of these people. Over 1,000 people benefited in my organization who were not working. So this is what we do on ground to ensure that people who come to a new country can at least have a soft landing to reintegrate into the society.
Thank you for explaining that. And we're definitely going to come back to some of the work that you're doing right now within the context of the pandemic. But I think, it was really good to hear what you all do, because I think you can really get a sense of, as Alex spoke about, the national ways, the national emergencies, international emergencies that force people to migrate. You're sort of talking about what happens after one migrates and lands in another country and the barriers that they face. And I'm an undocumented immigrant myself. Those are definitely things that my parents went through: language access or lack thereof, and just in general trying to navigate a new society. And I want to turn to Nathan because I understand that you mentioned your work is about the job guarantee or the idea of the right to having a job. And I think it kind of connects to what Adu is bringing up about people arriving here and sort of having a hard time in integrating into society as a whole. And so I guess my question for you, Nathan, is, right, we have these international disasters that force people to move. People are here, they're struggling. Why do you think that, one, would the right to a job be also for immigrants? Are we talking about just citizens? Is the right to a job for everyone? And what does that really mean for people who are maybe just arriving?
Yeah, so the Modern Money Network's position is absolutely that a legally enforceable right to a job should be something that immigrants have access to, whether they have prior documentation or not. The idea being that the point is to eliminate involuntary unemployment. The point is to change how the job market is structured and set a minimum standard. And by definition, if you're setting a minimum standard that a large group of people don't have applied to them, then they're inherently put below that standard. You're creating a position where employers who want to employ people at sub-minimum wages have a ready workforce that they can do, and that's contra the economic policy that we think the United States should be pursuing. And also, on the moral, ethical level, if people are here, people have families that are here, people, or more generally, people who are dependent on them, they need to have some way of accessing an economic livelihood, and it's not like they are not doing nothing. They are working and they are contributing through the public service work that you would be doing in the context of a job guarantee. A job guarantee isn't access to for-profit private work. Obviously, we're not eliminating that, but it's being employed. It's having your wages paid by the federal government and employed in some sort of public service. And obviously that isn't everything. I think, for example, disabled immigrants should have access to disability support just as much as anyone else. But a major contradiction or frustration that you have with people who are escaping volatile situations in other countries is they come to a place like Europe or the United States and they are barred from working, which puts them in a very economically precarious situation, which requires private aid from charitable organizations. And then they get demonized for being burdens on those societies when what's happening is that they're being barred from being able to access work. And I think, it's a common theme that you hear from people is that we just want to be able to work. That's all we were looking for when we were coming. And the United States, Europe makes that actively extremely difficult. And so, yeah, in terms of our advocacy of a legally enforceable right to a job, we think it should be a right to any resident, not just citizens or citizens and green card holders.
I'd like to hear a little bit of our other panelists' thoughts, either on the question of how to best integrate immigrants into, in this context, the U.S. society as they come here, or just in general, the experience of immigrants sort of integrating into the area that they're migrating to, and this idea maybe of the guaranteed right to a job and what that would mean for immigrants today, for example, if we had such a policy. I don't know, Alex, if you have any thoughts on this, or Adu, if you'd like to come in.
So I agree with Nathan on the general principle that a job is a good thing and will help immigrants and their kids integrate. I think we disagree on how to achieve that. But generally removing the regulatory and legal barriers to employment, I think is a thing we can both agree on. So it should not be against the law for anybody to get a job in the United States. Prior to 1986, it actually was not against the law for unlawful immigrants to work. And I think we should go back to that policy. Additionally, I think we need to get rid of many of the taxes on labor to give more of an incentive for people who are sort of on that edge. They're not sure if they want to work or not, but removing the taxes on labor for them would mean that they're more likely to choose to go into the labor market, as well as removing other government barriers, such as licensing laws that put in place by government-supported guilds that prevent people from working in the occupations where they want to, I think generally need to be entirely removed. So in my conception of free immigration, if a person living, just to use the example of one of my fellow panelists, if somebody in Nigeria voluntarily wants to work for an employer in New York City, and they agree to a wage where they both think it's fine, then that person should be able to work in New York City, and there should be no laws against that, period. As long as it's voluntary for both people. And that will do, I think, more than anything else to help immigrants integrate into the society of the United States, into our economy, because like working with strangers in mostly the English language, dealing with customers, dealing with your boss, dealing with everybody, you learn about the society, you learn how to interact and solve problems with people in the new society you're in. You learn about what's acceptable and unacceptable social behavior that may be different from where you're from. You learn about gender roles, the proper gender roles in the United States, respect for people of the opposite sex, what's acceptable behavior, which differs across countries. And this is a thing that I think the US does better than some other countries in the world, but we could do a lot better at. Getting people to work in fulfilling lives, to work in fulfilling jobs, also increases their self-confidence so that they can support themselves and their family and feel good about themselves. There's a lot of academic work on that. So I think anything we can do to make it easier for people to work in fulfilling jobs where they are happy, with the fewest amount of government barriers to employment, are things that'll be better for immigrants, better for their children, better for their integration into our society, and better for Americans.
Thank you. Thank you for that explanation. I mean, it definitely seems like, there's sort of a consensus here amongst you that immigrants should have the right to move, that people should have the right to move throughout the world without any threat to their safety or well-being, and that it should be made easy for people to then integrate into new societies. Aju, I'd like to ask you, these are, because some of the things that are being brought up are sort of, giving immigrants the right to move and the right to seek employment on the one hand, and on the other, sort of, whether immigrants and everybody really has the right to a job, which would also mean, sort of setting standards around wages that have to be enforced by the government. And so I'm wondering, Aju, in your work with undocumented immigrants right now, especially in a pandemic where people don't have work, people have never had the ability to work legally, but more so in a pandemic are having a hard time finding employment at all. Aju, what do you think in terms of employment would best benefit the people that you work with, immigrant communities, undocumented immigrant communities in New York City and the rest of the US?
Thank you for that question. That's a very important question, because without a job, it's without an income, you can't build wealth and you can't take care of your family. And having said that, we all agree here that policies and laws have a lot to has some role, in how easy people get employment. And for example, in the US, if you seek asylum, before now, if you are not called for interview within 45 days, you have to wait for 6 months before you apply for work permit. That means you'll be doing virtually nothing for 6 months. And now they've even changed the law to 365 days. If you apply for asylum now, if you are not called within the stipulated time, you have to wait for 1 year. 365 days before you get on it. That's a big challenge. If those are addressed, then the easy part will be job readiness. Doing job readiness for undocumented immigrants, because of language accessibility, because of language barrier, because of cultural differences. We understand African immigrants that we work with, both undocumented or documented ones, and we are able to train them culturally to understand how to look for jobs in the United States, train them based on interest, based on training, and based on experience. We match them to, what they can do for those who are able to work. right? But for those who are unable to work, we know it's still a very big challenge because we don't want to encourage anybody to go against the law. If you don't have papers to work, then what can we do? But right now, what we've been able to do is to see how we can help some people who can speak more than one language and have them form a cooperative, right? If you form a cooperative, that way you can do business in the United States without papers. If you are registered, you can do business in the United States, but you cannot work as an individual if you don't have papers. But if you don't have papers, you can start a business. So that's what we are looking at, forming a cooperative for our members, because most African immigrants can speak more than one language. I speak 4 languages, right? And this is an asset for undocumented immigrants who cannot work here. So for us, if we're able to mold them into a cooperative and register them, then they can provide the services and make some money while we work on policies and wait for when they are able to work normally in the United States. But generally, if these laws, like Alex said, there are not supposed to be limitations even. But of course, if there are laws, we understand why laws are made. But at least let it be, easy for people who are coming here genuinely to be able to work. So that's what we do. That's what we are trying to do. But the challenge is still there. Like I said, if you are not authorized to work, you can't work.
Can I add, sorry, one small thing to that?
Yes, Alex, please respond to that. And then I'd like to hear from Nathan on, sort of addressing both of the things that were brought by both speakers. But yes, go ahead, Alex.
So I'd like to just take one quick step back and just lay this out there, because the problem is right now, the government forces all employers to discriminate against immigrants. It forces them at the point of a gun. It's not optional, this discrimination. It limits the ability of unauthorized workers to get a job, of course, making that illegal. But even legal workers have significantly fewer rights. So I feel like, we can talk about these benefits and we can talk about job guarantees and we can talk about these other things. But if we ignore the elephant in the room, which is that it's illegal to work, period, for a vast majority of these people, and that employers must discriminate against them. It is the law. And we ignore that we're missing, I think, the most important problem, which is the government's laws discriminate against immigrants in a way that just, even if they want to work, and most of them do, makes it impossible for them to do so. And that all these other problems are real problems, but pretty small by comparison.
Nathan, would you like to come in to either take up that or any previous comments?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, definitely the first and foremost issue is that, as Alex says, the government requires by law that employers discriminate against undocumented immigrants. I mean, that's definitely far and away the biggest issue. I don't think it's necessarily a small thing that these other questions about affirmative benefits, especially in a situation right now where government mandated discrimination or not, undocumented immigrants would have a big difficulty accessing employment, especially because they are crowded into retail employment, which is in-person employment that is most directly affected by shutdowns. So, especially right now, I think these other questions about access to government benefits that are currently being reserved for citizens and green card holders is a very important question. More generally, from my point of view, part of the point about talking about the job guarantee and its role of being a public option of setting standards is to point out just how perverse it is to, as Alex says, require government mandated discrimination. Because requiring that discrimination means that you are helping to undermine setting standards in the labor market, because you have employers who, because they are taking on significant legal risk if they employ undocumented immigrants, well, their reward for doing so is paying sub-minimum wages or paying people under the table and not access to other government benefits. So, part of the point about talking about the job guarantee is we're saying that we should be setting standards in the labor market, and this government mandated discrimination is going the exact opposite direction of the standards we're trying to set. Normally, often immigration gets talked about in this way about, hurting wages, and thus we should be restrictive to immigration. But in fact, it's precisely the opposite. It is government mandated discrimination against immigrants that makes their labor market condition worse, and thus potentially has negative spillovers over other people. And if you make everyone subject to the same minimum labor market standards, then at the very least, everyone will have access to that same minimum standard. And the further affirmative point after that is that the job guarantee helps, makes that minimum standard as solid as possible. But I absolutely agree that government mandated discrimination is certainly the largest issue, but especially since I strongly suspect that even without government mandated discrimination, there would still be substantial discrimination in the labor market. A job guarantee can be partially a counterweight to that kind of issue. But
so
oh, sorry. And then one final thing is, I want take my chance to say that on the point about not being able to access government benefits, it's such a huge problem that undocumented immigrants don't have access to these benefits, because the point of these benefits, remember, is not, it's just some nice fancy reward. The point is to make it economically viable to stay home and not to seek employment and not to spread the coronavirus. And by denying these benefits to undocumented immigrants, we are making it impossible for them to do so. They have to go outside, even just the most basic thing, to seek food from somewhere, from a food bank, but more generally, to try to find some form of economic livelihood. And so we're encouraging them to jump at the first chance to, work in the back of someone's kitchen. It's not just harmful and devastating to undocumented persons. It is it's contradictory to the interest that we have in responding to deadly disease.
I know that we have to turn it over to questions in about a minute. And, I'd like to thank you all for your perspective. As I said, I do think that there are real points of agreement here in terms of immigration policy and even policies within the US about employment as it intersects with the question of immigration. I definitely have seen the way in which on a practical level, even though it feels like the government forces employers to discriminate, in reality, employers don't actually face a lot of consequences when they do employ undocumented immigrants. In fact, most of the enforcement around those policies we have seen has always been workplace raids. And at least to my knowledge, there's never been any big cases of employers or companies facing the brunt of enforcement in terms of fines, for example, as it's usually said. And so I definitely think that for me, these questions, and there are some opposing views here about how do you standardize wages in a way that benefits all undocumented immigrants? How would you fund that if you didn't have a taxation economy or taxes on unemployment in general? And so I think that those are definitely the questions that are coming up for me, and I'm really curious to see what will come up in the Q&A. Aju, can I ask you, as a last question, how does the problem on unemployment or immigrants, especially in the service industry, as Nathan pointed out, how are you seeing that affecting immigrant families in your work?
Thank you. I mean, it's obvious, like I said, these challenges of not being able to work or not able to earn income, affects families a lot. In my work, I meet people all the time who are in need of helping their families, supporting their families, but they couldn't do that because they cannot work. And like I said, it's really hard because we are limited by what we can do because of the policies, because of this law, because of what how immigration and job have been. I mean, how undocumented people have been limited in accessing anything here. So it's really hard. There's little or nothing we can do, but we have in our organization, we've been able to help some families with emergency fundings because we get this anonymous fund from some organization that we use sometimes to help people, help them with immigration fee sometimes, even help some families one-time help, and it's really challenging. And again, even undocumented people, right now with the public charge, it's even hard for them to access help because ordinarily people are supposed to get benefits to help them within a period before they can stabilize. Now it has been weaponized again against undocumented people. Now you cannot even get benefits. You cannot even get government help because if you get it, they are telling you you cannot live in this country anymore. Then people would rather die instead of going to the hospital to get services because they are waiting for green card. So what we tell people is, see, you have to take care of yourself. You don't have to say because of public charge or because of fear of not being able to naturalize, then refuse services. It's even more dangerous. What if you are sick? You say you don't want to get health benefits because you want a green card. What if even if you die in the process, you don't get the green card? So what we tell people is talk to a lawyer. We connect people to lawyers to hear them, and a lawyer will be able to determine and tell you what to do or what not to do. But it's really sad that, if you can't do anything. That's why we continue to advocate for policy change so that we can do what we have to do. Our hands are tied most of the time because of the laws, because of the policies. But if these things are being addressed, then we can do something, And these are the advocacy, challenges that we have to be able to advocate for undocumented people in totality, because we have laws that are even hindering us in doing all this. So yes, not having access to work, not having access to income really devastates our community, and it's really sad. This is one of the challenges I face every day in my work.
No, absolutely. I want to kick it over to Jamila or David for our Q&A portion, and you guys will get a chance to continue to answer people's questions.
Great. Thank you very much. So I actually am not going to be doing this portion. This is going to be for David. Thank you so much. But I just wanted to thank everyone for everything that they said. It was great in a lot of ways and confusing in others, I guess I could say. So I would like to have David come on, though, and perhaps go ahead and lead the question and answer. I don't see him popping up, though. David, are you? There you are. Okay, sorry. There we go. All right. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Lupita, Jamila, and thank you to the panelists. I'm going to take a risk and try to bundle a couple of the questions together. First, the more general question from Nandita Sharma, which is Alex's statement that poverty has been around as long as humans tends to depoliticize the existence of poverty. Scholars have shown the existence of class rule and states it's only about 5,000 years old. What changes when we understand poverty as an outcome of class rule and not simply a part of the human condition? And perhaps a more specific facet of that question comes from Abigail Ginsburg, who asks, for Alex, what does voluntary employment look like to you? For people with little economic or social capital, how do we ensure that they are not exploited on the labor market?
Yeah, so my background is in economic history, and that's what I got my master's degree in, and that I frequently publish in. So I don't know who told you that poverty is only 5,000 years old, but that is simply incorrect. Poverty, in terms of material poverty, is the normal human condition, unfortunately. That's not a happy thing, but it's only relatively recently that some places have been able to escape that. So that's just the situation, unfortunately, of humanity. In terms of what we can do to make sure that employment is voluntary, well, the first thing we do is remove the government actions are always backed up by force. If you don't do what the government says, they will use force to force you to. And if you resist that force frequently, they kill you, or at least severely injure you or put you in jail. In the case of immigration, how do we ensure, or at least try to move toward a situation where most of these jobs are not exploitative, is to remove that element of force and coercion from the situation. So currently, a lot of unauthorized immigrants who get jobs can be abused by their employers, because the employers can fire them, not pay them their last paycheck, and then can say, well, what are you going to do about it? If you complain, I'll just call ICE to come and get you. So if we remove that element of coercion from it, it creates much better scenario. And I want to say about the discrimination point, we sort of focused on undocumented immigrants in the US, and that's true. But the most destructive and pervasive discrimination is against the people overseas who want to come here to work and who can't. That is where it's the unseen discrimination there that is the most destructive. The tens, 20s, hundreds of millions of people who want to come here who are not allowed to because of government enforced discrimination against them in the labor market. That is the challenge. That is the big discrimination in the room. The government prevents employers and those people from voluntarily agreeing to a labor market contract to sell their labor to Americans who want to buy it. That is the problem. As much as I want, Lupita has a problem with the immigration status, and I want her to be able to get a green card and become a citizen and to not face any of these labor market challenges. But, and I'm going down a limb here, I would much rather be in her legal situation than to be a poor person in a third world country living on $2 a day without the option to even live in a black market in a first world country.
So I'm going to just, I'm going to go ahead and just reel it in real quick. Just real quick. I understand the point that you're trying to make, and I think that I hear you. However, I think it would be preferable that you maybe not name off members of the panel that are undocumented that are facing state violence whenever you're making the comparison. I don't think that that's maybe the most appropriate way to do it, because I don't just in this moment that might not be ideal. So please continue though. I would like to go ahead and just stop that now. Thank you.
No, I'm done.
Is there another question, David?
Yes. So in this, I think for any of the panelists, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Azadeh Erfani asked, this pandemic has made the call for universal basic income really resonate, especially as people of color were both at the front lines through their essential jobs and losing their jobs disproportionately. Given that rising interest, what about universal basic income for all, including immigrants?
I think I'll take that. I think it's probably directed to me more than anyone else. So, I mean, that gets into a larger conversation, which is beyond the scale of this panel. My organization has been kind of very aggressively supporting emergency basic incomes for the duration of this crisis. My colleague, Rowan Gray, helped write Rashida Tlaib's ABC Act, which is about giving $2,000 a month to everyone, including undocumented immigrants, through distribution centers that would dole out reloadable debit cards. So for people who wouldn't have direct deposit access, obviously. And so in the writing of that bill was specifically written in such a way that undocumented persons would have access to those payments as well. But generally, for reasons outside beyond the scope of this, we're not generally fans of universal basic income. But that said, any sort of basic income policy that's supposed to be that is originally designed for every citizen, we think should be for any resident of the United States.
Nathan, a follow-up question for that, and I think bringing it back to some of the previous questions. My question was actually, what would be the difference between a basic income guarantee and a guaranteed right to employment? Is there any overlap in that idea, or are they radically different?
They share some of the same inclinations, impetuses. I would say that the job guarantee policy is specifically aimed about restructuring the labor market, and it's primarily about the labor market, and it's about the function of the labor market, and also about reallocating resources between different sectors. The idea that you have something like a job guarantee in place, and for example, in the Green New Deal, shutting down certain carbon intensive areas of production becomes easier because you're not generating mass unemployment. So it's generally primarily seen as a labor market policy and not a replacement for other policies that are supposed to support anyone, whether they're workers or not. Whereas the universal basic income, obviously, would have labor market effects, but it's primarily, the motivation is separate from questions of the labor market. So often they're pitted against each other, but I think that they are distinct policies with distinct purposes and goals.
David, I'm wondering if there's any last questions before we wrap up.
Sure, thank you. From Charlene Belsom-Zelmer, climate, war, poverty, and over-policing migration are already happening. To the panelists, how do you see the US moving quickly toward full immigration reform, moving from the bloated bureaucracy to the half page of policy that Alex mentioned?
So I'll start. Crises make reform harder. One of the things that we know about is when there's a crisis related to immigration, usually the response of the government where they want to go is to double down on enforcement, is to build higher walls, to, in the case of Australia, deploy the Navy to stop boat people from coming, to deport people in greater numbers, and to make it more difficult to legally come. So crises expose the need to expand legal immigration as much as possible. But perversely, in counter to that, they create a feeling among voters and governments that they need to stop it. In the same way, and this is contrary to what we learn about American history. But what we learn about American history, most of it's not true. So like prohibition of alcohol, we learn this story that it was a grand social experiment and it was ended because everybody saw the crime that happened. And that's not true. It was ended because there was a depression and the government wanted to raise money by taxing alcohol. That's why it ended, not because of the crisis of crime from prohibition, but from the economic crisis. So the only types of crises that could potentially lead to liberalization and opening up immigration or domestic debt crises or something like that. But these other crises of war, climate, poverty, my great fear about this is that it will cause governments like the US to restrict immigration more. That's my great fear and what keeps me up at night.
Thank you for that. The question that was asked related, sort of also to the question of what could immigration reform look like, or what would a less bureaucratic immigration reform look like? And I want to kick it to Adu. For you, as someone who's working with undocumented immigrants or immigrants at large, at times in the context of a debate on immigration reform, what is the ideal immigration reform that you would like to see our administration, this new administration, especially move towards?
Well, for me, I think, any reform that will include respect, dignity for immigrants, fair wage, equality, all this should be included in the conversation and in the process of ensuring that we have a robust immigration reform. Although I know some progress were made before this present administration came into power, and since this administration tenure, we've seen more divisions. We've seen a whole lot of immigration policies and laws that even make it harder for people not to only come here, but to even breathe in this country and find life. So for me, any immigration reform that will be put forward should dignify immigrants, should respect immigrants, because people who leave their country to come start a new life in another country, most of them are professionals. Most of them have good lives. So they are not people to be pitied. You don't just come up with laws and feel, let's just allow them, policies that just keep you at the bottom of the ladder and you are not recognized. So those are not reforms that will bring any significant change to immigrants' life, but reforms that are humane, that dignify people, that respect people and give them the equal opportunity to achieve whatever they want to achieve here. Those are the kind of reform we want to see. And I'm optimistic that the incoming administration will pay more attention, and because of the fact that it will be, I believe they will be sympathetic to the plight and causes of immigrants. I'm optimistic that we'll see something good. But for me, this is what I want to see: reforms that will dignify people and give them the equal opportunity to have a better life in a new land. That's what I would think.
Thank you, Adu, for that. It looks like we are at time for this panel. I want to thank all of the panelists for your thoughts. I definitely think that, there were differing viewpoints on many questions here. But I think for me, listening through the conversation, what really comes through the most is that we're at a time where in the US and globally, we have national crises that are international in their nature when we're talking about this pandemic, when we're talking about political and economic conflict, and that any US policy or international policy that deals with immigrants and immigration sort of has to address the realities that immigrants are living in. And I think to the question of a guaranteed right to a job, of decriminalizing immigration, and to the last question that was asked, for me, I really see some of the viewpoints that have been brought up in this panel to be very helpful in how we think about our way moving forward. When it comes to, as Alex mentioned, ending enforcement of the borders, ending the violent state enforcement of borders and the bureaucracy that impedes people from coming here, from being able to integrate, as Adu mentioned, decriminalizing immigrants' ability to work, to receive benefits. And even Nathan, when he brings up the right to a guaranteed job, I think what we're really talking about is, in general, in times like these, where there's a pandemic, really stopping anyone or from working in a safe way, or a lot of people, and mostly undocumented immigrants, we really do need policies that provide a safety net to everyone, a safety net that means that they will be able to feed their families, that they will be able to take care of themselves, and move forward past this crisis. So I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to some of the other questions that were brought up, but I really want to thank both the panelists and people who participated in the Q&A for their questions. I think they were all illuminating. And I think that this wraps us up for today.